Hi everyone, welcome to my latest presentation. This is for the members area, so geared with more the layperson in mind and taken from a presentation I did on Alzheimer's, which I actually titled Neurodegeneration, really encompassing the concepts of neurological decline and damage that's associated with the central nervous system, leading to aspects of disease like dementia, Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, and other cognitive deficits. So we looked at aspects of environmental causes and the concepts of adaptive nutrition. Throughout the presentation, what I was trying to get people to think about is how perhaps similarities between neurodegeneration and cancer are fairly similar, because there are aspects of biology that's not at its best working order. And one of the key influences of how we maintain biology at our best working order is essentially by keeping the body temperature at its most reliable temperature, which is around about 37 degrees. We know that when the body temperature is at 37 degrees, enzymes function really well, neural transmission is much better at this temperature, and also aspects of metabolism are seriously enhanced as well. This quote by Ray Peat is a good suggestion about how people, when their body temperature is low, and also when their energy, blood sugar regulation, and other factors are also low, how the concepts related to cognition, mood, function are significantly decreased. If we think about even just the concept of hangriness, we've gone a long period without time. We all perhaps present ourselves with some aspect of demented state, being irritable because we haven't eaten for so long, and facilitating the stress response and trying to liberate energy from our stored fats. And this can be a problem when this is chronic over time. But we tend to look at the concept of dementia being related to older people, but we might actually just pull it back for a second and perhaps suggest that it's related to anyone when their function is not as good as it could be. So with that in mind, within this seminar we're going to be looking at the causes, or the well-documented causes, of Alzheimer's, discussing the role of beta amyloid. Is there a gut-brain connection? The burden of proof from aluminium. Concepts of adaptive nutrition and adaptive substances. Some of this will have a significant carryover from the things that we've already talked about in some of our presentations. So what is Alzheimer's? Well, Alzheimer's or dementia or neurodegeneration is really, the heart of it is altered metabolism. We see the mitochondria or the cells not functioning efficiently. There's often oxidative stress. Often there's a loss of efficient carbohydrate utilization, and we'll be looking at aspects of the redox mechanism. But this creates a lot of cellular stress and inflammation. That's usually a double whammy as well, because often we see large amounts of inflammation and bacterial end products from the production of endotoxin or lipopolysaccharide within the bowel. This can have some significant issues when it crosses the digestive barrier into the bloodstream. We'll be looking at that as well. What we start to see is the accumulation of extracellular amyloids, tangling of the proteins, tangling of the tau structures, or hyperphosphorylation of these tau structures, which we'll also be looking at. Interestingly enough, in this slide just here, you can see above is the beta amyloid in the green, and then we have the phosphorylated tau, which is in the structures, which also causes problems associated with dementia. So back to this. So we also see increases in apolipoproteins, which is usually associated with cholesterol levels and carrying of cholesterol, and also the deposition of amyloid, which might increase with the foldings of the amyloid proteins, and we'll be looking at that as well. We'll often see high states of hypothyroidism. We'll often see beta amyloid increase in its folding, and then progress to the problematic and pathological plaques, and again this hyperphosphorylated tau proteins and structures. We'll often see then the issues of cognition. So all of these things generally occurring before we see deficits in cognition, memory, neurotransmission, movement, and the bioenergetic deficits that are associated with that. So it tends to be a bit of a vicious cycle, and obviously have many things that tend to be driving this state that lead us to this kind of neurocognitive decline. In the environment, there tend to be many things that contribute to this state. I've been a bit lazy here and used an old slide that's related to hormone dysfunction, but it kind of sets the scene for what's going on. So, for example, pollution, which we find in our obviously our air, water, food. I've talked about the concepts of polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons that create issues because they act like estrogens, plastics in water, pollutants in food. All of these have a significant effect to how our biology functions, and most noticeably how our metabolism and breakdown of foods into energy is carried out. Obviously, these foods also, the pollution tends to have high levels of metals. We'll be looking at the documented effects of aluminium. We know that other metals like mercury pose a significant threat to not just function of the the central nervous system, but also aspects of thyroid function as well. So metals like mercury have a very deleterious effect on the thyroid, noticeably by inhibiting selenium, which is a key driver of the deiodinase enzymes. We also have aspects of inheritance. Now, a lot of people will go and get tested and they'll have their genes that dictate their perhaps potential to develop Alzheimer's. I find this still a backward phenomenon, and it is definitely rooted in the concepts of neo-Darwinism. Now, just to make sense that Darwin was actually right about quite a few things, and he agreed with the acquired inheritance of Lamarck, who was generally considered to be one of the first people who considered the effects of inheritance and evolution and biology. And Darwin, I think, had some disagreements with him, but he often didn't think that the genes drove the state. And we often talk about the concept of why genes are not as important as we think they are. So if you think about, say, like an MP3 file, that's a music file, it's relatively inert on its own. It doesn't create anything, but you need something to play that on, whether it's a phone or an iPod or some computer to play that particular tune that you want to play. So unless you have that, unless it's switched on, unless it has the power, you're not going to get the expression of the genes. So that genes can be relevant to a degree, but their insistence that genes drive the disease state is a somewhat reduced notion. And also the concepts of DNA progression to influencing the RNA and the proteins, which was considered to be a one-way street. That's also two ways. The proteins from the altered metabolism can influence the RNA, or the ribonucleic nucleic acid, to the DNA. So this is where we see reverse kind of transcription that affects the genes. We also have aspects of viral infection. Herpes virus is well known to influence dementia and influence levels of dementia and Alzheimer's. An interesting thing as well is that medical drugs can have a synergistic negative effect on viral infections, because drugs like statins, which lower cholesterol, when we lower cholesterol, we lower the body's natural immunity and antioxidant status. So a double whammy of being exposed to a herpes virus with low cholesterol is going to have a significant impact on the rate and progression of an Alzheimer's or demented state. And we also have aspects of the internal gut-brain axis and the microbiome, which we'll be discussing very shortly as well. So, unfortunately, beta amyloid is considered to be one of the main drivers of the Alzheimer's and dementia state. But there needs to be some clarification here. We have two hypotheses. Previously, and what's been really the target of medical interventions and immunosuppressive therapies, is the concept of the cascade. That when dementia or Alzheimer's states are present, there's a cascade of this beta amyloid leading to the progression of the disease states. However, more recently, in the last decade or so, what's tend to be considered is the concept of the BAD hypothesis, or the beta amyloid dysfunction. And with that, what the concepts is that beta amyloid is actually a very normal thing to have in the body. It's very functional. It acts as almost like an antimicrobial peptide. And when there's damage going on, beta amyloid can go to structures within the brain, ends of neurons and other structures, to create a protective response. So having a certain amount of beta amyloid is actually really protective. And some of the medical interventions like secretase inhibitors which seek to lower the beta amyloid, has actually found that it made Alzheimer's worse. Why? Because it's a bit like taking cholesterol away from the body. It reduces the immunity and the ability to fight off any potential infections or insults to the body. But the real problem arises is that when these beta amyloid tend to progress to, as you can see on this diagram here, more into the early pathology state. It's gone from the usual monomer into kind of the fibril pathway, or it's what's considered the early neurotoxic beta amyloid, which are soluble. Now, if this progresses to the fibril type or the senile plaques, this is where we're going to see sustained pathology to this dementia and Alzheimer's state. So considering that the plaques are the end game and that there's a functional aspect to beta amyloid is really important. We want to make sure that that beta amyloid is there to act as a response to potential damage, which can come from a number of insults from the environment. But if it does proceed to this kind of protofibril and fibril pathway and progress to senile plaque, it is going to be extremely problematic. The other structure we need to be concerned of is the tau structures. Now, tau structures, again, are proteins and fibrils that when they become hyperphosphorylated will also be increased in the demented and Alzheimer's-like state. And it's interesting to note the effects of estrogens and progesterones on these kind of tau structures, because there's been some research that shows that these can be improved. Now, what's really interesting is aluminium has been touted as a significant factor in the onset of disease-like states. There's Professor Christopher Exley, who has spent the last 30 years producing over 180 papers and review articles on the role of aluminium to increase the amount of dementia and Alzheimer's-like states. Now, there tends to be some contentiousness about aluminium. Sometimes you'll see on various sites where or kind of bodies that suggest aluminium doesn't actually have a role, but there is clear and irrefutable evidence that aluminium and the progression of beta amyloid to the plaque state, it's actually there, and it's inextricably linked and pretty much irrefutable that it's part of the disease process. If you look at A here you can see the picking up of an aluminium structure within the central nervous system. In slide B, you'll see the increase in beta amyloid, and in C, you see that the dual beta amyloid and aluminium, and you can see that the amyloid is kind of trying to surround it and perhaps provide some kind of protection against what the aluminium is doing. So this is where you see the progression of the states from the use of beta amyloid to protect the body and protect the nervous system. But again, it's the progression to the plaque that makes this progression problematic. Now, I encourage you to go and look at Christopher Exley's papers. Just type in Keele University and Christopher Exley, and you'll come across all his papers and commentaries on increases aluminium. And there are even suggestions here that aluminium within vaccines as an aluminium adjuvant to stimulate the immune process is a very real problem. The increase of aluminium in kind of pots and pans, and even in foods, many different foods, it tends to have increased as well, and also within other environmental issues as well. So do check that out and have a look at that and make your own mind up about whether aluminium is a key driver of that state. So another key factor in Alzheimer's and dementia and damage to the central nervous system is the often accumulative effects of endotoxin. Endotoxin, or lipopolysaccharide, is the kind of end product of bacterial degradation, particularly of the gram-negative bacteria. So when you have high amounts of gut bacteria, and particularly these gram-negative, the amount of endotoxin that's released is often excessive. And the concept of the lipo, the fat, and the polysaccharide, the carbohydrate together, increases these endotoxin metabolites that are particularly damaging to the gastrointestinal wall, brush border enzymes, and have the ability to cross into the bloodstream. Endotoxin has generally been found to be about 30% higher in the brains of those with Alzheimer's disease at autopsy. So this is certainly worth considering from a gut bowel perspective. Now, as we talked about before, the concept of microbiome and using bacteria and probiotics is not something I particularly believe in. So I think keeping bacteria to a minimal, using your carrot salads, what we've talked about before, is particularly helpful for ensuring that endotoxin is kept to a minimum. Damage to the bowel is kept to the minimum, and instead of endotoxin being allowed to progress across the abdominal wall through the tight junctions and perhaps other damaged areas, going up to the blood-brain barrier, crossing into the brain, and also being implicated in increasing more beta amyloids and more progressions to the senile plaques. Keeping endotoxin low and manageable and keeping the gut in relatively good health is just one of the things that you can do to help alter or influence the progression of this kind of degraded neurological state. So advice for preventing that is just keeping gut healthy, carrot salad, boiled bamboo shoots, use of activated charcoal, etc. Now, this is something that I keep going over because it seems to be very, very relevant. Now, whatever disease state you're in, whether it's cancer, whether it's neurodegeneration, whether it's other aspects of disease and reduced biology, but the hallmark of disease is a lack of function in the redox pathway. So when we say redox, we talk about reduction and oxidation. Now, if we look at the start of this in electron transport chain at the first complex of 1, we see NAD is reduced to NADH. Now, this is where generally the most problems occur, because as we start to produce energy, if we're saying we're degrading fats all the time, or if we lost the flexibility to utilize carbohydrates, we often get a backup, and so this NADH accumulates and decreases the ratio of this NAD to NADH. Now, if we get furthermore insults along the electron transport chain, for example, pollution like carbon monoxide, cyanides, all of these things can damage the electron transport chain, and so can estrogens as well. So the progressive loss of carbohydrate metabolism can create this ratio in phase 1 complex. And we start to see lots of other oxidants occurring and being used up excessively. So carbohydrate is wasted, oxygen is wasted, and everything goes on long enough, the water amount of energy that's produced and carbon dioxide diminishes, and we start to rapidly shift towards glycolysis. Now, there are many things that shift towards this kind of reductive state of metabolism, and they're the vegetable fats, estrogens, your pollutants, your intense exercise if chronic enough, and other biological insults as well. So keeping your aerobic system maintained and functioning as well as it can is again another key thing that we can do. In Alzheimer's and dementia, this redox loss is often well cited within the literature, and we see all sorts of problematic energy production processes going on within the central nervous system and the brain itself. And this is the last place that we want to see ongoing breakdown of fats as a fuel, ongoing use of the unsaturated fatty acids, increasing in acidity, damaging the neurons, breaking down the white matter, and leading to further degrades or downregulation of the central nervous system. So we talk about the concepts of adaptive nutrition. And so, for example, what the real concept is, if when we do have a specific loss of function, we're looking to restore that function and also to become robust to the stimulus that's around us. A lot of people, their biology has been suppressed because the environment's dictating the conversation all the time. The environment is shouting the insults at someone's biology all the time. And instead of being able to mount a conversation back, the biology very, very slowly degrades. So we need to look at aspects of function, whether it's increasing that redox potential that we just talked about, whether it's increasing sugar metabolism, which is part of that redox metabolism, adding coffee in, vitamin A, calcium phosphorus ratio, or our fats. These are all key things that we need to consider to make someone's nutrition be an adaptive stimulus that creates stronger biological function over time within a stressful environment. So as I said, sugar metabolism is something that we're interested in maintaining, and we've talked about that considerably before. It doesn't mean just because we can't use sugar that we should cut it out of the diet. Sometimes cutting back on it if somebody's really stressed out and increasing it gradually can be a useful thing that we need to do. We know that coffee, for example, is just one of the many substances that has a really beneficial effect on Alzheimer's and dementia progression. And I think if you looked at the coffee video that's also in the members area, it has slightly more information on some of the studies where it's shown coffee, because it stimulates aerobic function, because it stimulates redox potential, because it helps as an antioxidant, has very beneficial effects for improving sugar metabolism, improving the energetic state of the central nervous system. And generally, as a rule of thumb, most people who consume coffee tend to have a much lower risk of Alzheimer's disease progression. Vitamin A is particularly useful to be concerned about, and there are plenty of studies that have showed that even at kind of a moderate or mild vitamin A deficiency, there was approximately twofold more prevalence of dementia and Alzheimer's disease. And increased cognitive decline is generally positively correlated with lower progression. Increased cognitive decline is positively associated with lower vitamin A status. And generally, as a rule of thumb, that even those who are exposed to low vitamin A status embryologically might express genes that are more inclined to say that they're more likely to get Alzheimer's at a later state. Then this can most likely be resolved just by consuming more vitamin A within the diet. Getting 1 or 2 pieces of liver in a week can be particularly helpful. And in rodent studies, for example, these deficits, this plaque formation, these genes being expressed from vitamin A deficiency in a prenatal and embryonic stage have generally been reversed, showing improved memory function and reduced cognitive deficits when vitamin A has been added into the equation. So I can't state again the effectiveness of understanding the role of vitamin A for hormone conversion, and for liver function, and for protecting against cancer, and for protecting against the progression of Alzheimer's and dementia. Another thing to consider is calcium phosphorus ratio. If you are eating a diet that's high in meats and cereals and vegetables, it's quite likely that your phosphorus ratio tends to be problematic and concerned with your calcium. Some people wax lyrical about how broccoli has a certain amount of calcium in it, but you have to actually consume vast amounts of broccoli to get anywhere near the amount of calcium that you might get out from, say, a glass of milk. So making sure that your dairy and calcium-rich foods are quite high in the diet. This will prevent the increase in parathyroid hormone, the hormones that are used to take calcium out of the bones and increase the osteoporotic state. You could argue with it when you're seeing kind of this low regulation of calcium states. If calcium is taken out of the bone and reabsorbed from the bone, generally it's dysregulated and can show up in soft tissues, and also contributes to the excitotoxic state that you tend to see with cellular function when calcium is quite high and going into other soft tissues and cells. We're also quite well versed now on the role of saturated fat versus PUFA. Generally, as a rule of thumb, PUFA in the brain structures can be extremely problematic. There are some studies that suggest that you should have a higher level. The problem is that when these issues are taken into account from a biological perspective, and we look at concepts of the peroxidation index, generally those with lower amounts of unsaturated fats in the diet will live longer than those people with higher unsaturated fats, because they're extremely damaging to biology. And when you get these unsaturated fats in the brain and they're being used as a fuel source, this can be particularly problematic to increasing the amount of damage that occurs within the central nervous system, within the other structures like the neurons and other areas, the oligodendrocytes and all these other places in the brain that are extremely sensitive. And when we have fats being oxidized, like polyunsaturated fats, they tend to cause more damage. The saturated fats, if they're in excess, can be problematic, but generally having a moderate of saturated fats in the diet is extremely protective. So now we move on to the adaptive substances, and again, these are things that most of you are quite well versed in from the information that's been put forward on the members site. So generally, thyroid, carbon dioxide, progesterone, methylene blue, aspirin, and light are very useful adaptive substances. There are obviously more vitamin E, vitamin C, but they might come under the concepts of adaptive nutrition. And again, this seminar it's certainly not existential. There are many things that we could also add into this. But for the sake of just keeping things concise, we are adding probably the most important things in that I can think of at this moment. So hypothyroidism, obviously, we know that tends to permeate every aspect of function. There are definitely some key issues related to the aspects of biochemistry and clinical evaluation. And I think a lot of people who are progressing to the dementia state will probably have some kind of misconception of what the thyroid's doing. Some of the clients that I've seen in the older state tend to have very cold extremities. They tend to have low thyroid symptoms such as sometimes constipation, poor energy regulation, slower movements. Remember, the body might be slightly colder. There are many things that from a thyroid perspective need to be looked at. And although people think of the cold bodies as a natural progression of the aging state, I might argue that actually keeping the body in its warmest state so that the enzymes function aren't being pushed to hypothermic states where body temperature is lost and therefore function is lost might be something that is going to be particularly useful for preventing Alzheimer's and dementia progression. What's interesting to note is that in low thyroid states, cerebral metabolism and blood flow are both significantly decreased. So there's often low amounts of T3, the active form of thyroid hormone, that is often found in the Alzheimer's and dementia state, and obviously quite important from aspects of neurodegeneration. When people or someone is in a low thyroid state, their ability to regulate their energy, going back to that redox state again, is significantly decreased. If someone is in a normal, healthy body and they are producing thyroid responses like increasing TSH, for example, as the thyroid hormone isn't available, increased and abnormal amounts of thyroid stimulating hormone will promote the increase of beta amyloids and the progression to the plaque-like states. So this is really important to consider, is that a lot of older people who perhaps going into their 70s and 80s, they may not eat as regularly as they should do, and therefore could present with a stress state that means that some TSH responses just don't react to levels of thyroid hormone because they're in a low energy state. When they're in a low energy state, the pituitary ability to increase TSH, and also often from the hypothalamus, that state is also decreased. And so the ability to mount a response by increasing TSH is actually lost. Therefore, the blood tests again appear completely normal. There's obviously a synergy with carbon dioxide, excuse me, because many people who are in a low thyroid state can tend to hyperventilate. When you hyperventilate, as you will have seen from the breathing videos, is that we tend to waste carbon dioxide and it will decrease the amount of oxygen available because you're heading towards a respiratory alkalosis. That means not enough carbon dioxide is available, which does increase the acidity within the cell and the blood so that oxygen can disassociate from hemoglobin. And therefore maintaining thyroid and carbon dioxide levels is going to be key to decreasing the Alzheimer's and dementia progression. Another thing that we need to consider is the role of progesterone. You will see many studies that suggest that estrogen is beneficial for a dementia-like state, but you have to look at some of the data that's out there. There are often some contrasting results. For example, we talked about earlier on about how the secretase inhibitors, which lower beta amyloid, tended to make Alzheimer's and dementia states much worse. And this was also shown with estrogen therapies. It actually decreased the functional beta amyloids. Now, the functional beta amyloids are the proteins that are there for managing a response to any infections or trauma or insults to the central nervous system. When they progress to the tangled and the senile plaques, this is a problem. But what estrogen was doing was lowering the beta amyloid production and had zero effect on the hyperphosphorylated tau, the other structures known to be present in dementia. What's interesting enough is that progesterone didn't lower the functional beta amyloid, but it also lowered the hyperphosphorylated tau structures that were associated, and this was associated with the improved outcomes from a dementia and a neurocognitive decline. So it's really important to put these into context. There's also quite a few studies that show that the aromatase inhibitors, which basically stop the progression of increased aromatase, which will convert other hormones such as testosterone to the estrogens, have a pretty good effect on preventing dementia. The other waters that tend to be muddied are the statin studies and reviews as well. There are many studies out there that suggest that statins can have a particularly protective effect against dementia, but a lot of these studies carry quite a lot of bias, and when these have been looked at and the bias has been removed, they've generally shown in peer-reviewed journals that risk is generally not there or has zero effect at all on the progression of dementia and Alzheimer's-like states. Now, aspirin is well known. One of the reasons why aspirin could be particularly useful is because aspirin will act as a mitochondrial uncoupler and reduce the amount of fat being oxidized. So that can be particularly helpful when someone's stuck in a chronic wasting state of fats, increasing the amount of oxidation and damage that occurs to the nervous system. Now, some of the recent reviews on aspirin have suggested that one of the risks is gastric bleeds, and that's still kind of tied up in the old data about giving large doses of it. That can be easily avoided with having the appropriate dose and by also taking adequate amounts of vitamin K2 so that clotting does actually occur, because aspirin is well known to decrease clotting because it's a blood thinner. So I think this can generally be avoided, and doses generally anywhere between 50 to up to about 300 milligrams I've found tend to be quite safe and don't cause any digestive distress. So aspirin is just one of those garden variety compounds that's available that can be used on a daily basis as well. Now, the one that I've always found really, really interesting is the use of methylene blue. Now, methylene blue has been around for quite a long time. It's a synthetic dye. And our man Albert St. Georgi here, our 1936 Nobel Science winner for isolating vitamin C or ascorbic acid, has this statement here that he made, which is quite enticing to think about what it can actually do. So he's shown that when you poison the aerobic system, and we go back to that redox potential slide, is that when any of those complexes are shut down, particularly from phase 1 where the dehydrogenases are, all the way up to oxygen production, is that these tend to be shut down through poisoning. Estrogen can do it, carbon monoxide, cyanides. But when he found that he added methylene blue to the aerobic system, this redox potential was restored. So it's a very, very well-studied dye that has been shown to be very, very beneficial for a number of areas. And you can see these areas here. Tissue hypoxia should make sense because when we have a low oxygen state, our aerobic system doesn't work. Why? Because there's not much oxygen around, and tissues will favour glycolysis. So adding this blue dye in would tend to create a better oxygenated state. Now, in Parkinson's dementia, methylene blue has shown to be very, very effective at halting the progression and increasing cognitive abilities and in testing. The other thing is that when we add red light to methylene blue, it can enhance the oxidative capacity by restoring our phase 4 and 5 complex within that redox potential. So essentially what's happening, red light and methylene blue restore the aerobic system up to its full working mechanism, so that oxygen being used, the production of adenosine triphosphate, our energy currency, and also the production of water and carbon dioxide is our most efficient form of energy, and this is restored when methylene blue and red light has been used together. Now, it's also shown to be very, very effective as an anti-parasite, anti-infections post-surgery, improves thyroid hormone availability, and many, many more. And I think there'll be more studies coming out on methylene blue. There are quite a lot. There are hundreds and hundreds of studies on methylene blue, and a lot of them do show significant benefit to halting the progression of dementia and Alzheimer's. The obviously well talked about aspects of light physiology. We obviously have our well-known vitamin D, which helps to regulate calcium, act as a immunomodulator and other things. That's well known that we need adequate ultraviolet light. We obviously just talked about red light and its impact on restoring the aerobic system. So making sure that our Alzheimer's and dementia people get plenty of light and even extra exposure to the red light spectrum is going to be particularly helpful. Trying to improve the circadian profiles during the long days of sunlight, getting out into as much natural sunlight as we can. In the winter, perhaps using UVB lights and also red spectrum lights as well. If you are staying up at night and you're doing something, make sure you have some extra red light around till you're ready to start getting off into your kind of sleep phase, because that red light can still be very, very helpful. Also, thinking about the excess blue light that people tend to be exposed to, screens, computers, TVs, and whatnot, and trying to manage the excess of blue light, incorporating better exposure to the red light spectrums, and considering the circadian profiles throughout the seasons is extremely important for improving function. Now, to recap that, all the things that we need to be putting together is managing environment. So for some people, when you live in a particularly polluted area, getting air filters into your house, consider your house as your cocoon where you're going to regenerate. You're going to have some restorative inhibition by getting good sleep. So if your house is perhaps in a very polluted area, making sure that you're able to clean the air within the house, avoiding spraying some of the harmful chemicals that you get from the cleaning products. Remember, if you can smell something, it's already in your bloodstream, and that's something that you need to consider. Trying to avoid using if you can smell, for example, in your dishwasher, you can smell the tablets. It's a good consideration that might be coming out through the plumbing or through the device itself. And all of these things, however small, can contribute to reduced energetic function. So just ensure that you're able to manage your environment as much as you can. Think about the concepts of adaptive nutrition. Think about why getting enough caffeine in, enough dairy, increasing sugar and fruit intakes, decreasing perhaps some of the cereals, getting adequate fats in the form of saturated fats, and many other things like vitamin C and vitamin E can be very, very helpful for restoring function. Think about these adaptive substances, maintaining thyroid function, adequate progesterone, perhaps even testosterone or DHEA, and minimizing the risk associated with estrogens. Thinking about getting enough light, perhaps using compounds like methylene blue to restore biology. And I think what's really important here, and not part of this slide, is how we can use nature to help to regenerate. There is considerable research on how better people feel when they're in an environment surrounded by trees and green fields, and you can't underestimate the effect that has on biology, particularly also because you're often moving away from urban environments, not exposed to diesel and petrochemical fumes and pollution. So that can be particularly important. Some of the other things in research that definitely seems to be well proven is learning. Learning a hobby or a language is a key component of anti-dementia or anti-Alzheimer's decline. So if we want to improve how our brains function, we consider something like Hebb's postulate, which is that neurons that fire together, wire together, or our concept of use it or lose it. So learning something new can stimulate new synaptic connections within the brain, and this can help to rewire the brain in a positive way that challenges the brain. But obviously people who have advanced dementia have such a degraded brain and function that they're not able to learn new things. But getting people to move and learn and do and get into nature can be very, very useful for helping to not just halt various dementia-like states, but also to progress them. So I hope you've enjoyed that talk on neurodegenerative decline, how to look at some of the adaptive substances, look at the adaptive nutrition, and also to manage environment. If you have any questions or feedback, feel free just to send that over to me, and I look forward to getting a new seminar out to you really soon. Thank you very much.